In September 1992, a group of hunters stumbled upon an abandoned bus deep in the Alaskan wilderness. Inside the bus, they found the decaying body of a young man curled up in the corner. Next to the corpse, they discovered a camera filled with dozens of self-portraits captured during the final days of his life. Through fragmented words in his journal, they began to piece together the incredible story of this young man. It's said that countless people saw reflections of their own lives in his journey. Some mourned him as a tragic idealist, while others admired him as a brave soul who broke free from society's chains. This soul, forever frozen at the age of 24, was Chris McCandless. Chris was born into a wealthy family, but he held values that set him apart. Despite his privileged upbringing, he remained detached from material wealth. He often drove an old, beat-up second-hand car, but with his stellar academic performance, he earned a full scholarship and graduated from Emory University. With grades like his, the doors of Harvard Law School were always open to him. Yet this brilliant young man made a shocking choice. Chris donated all $24,000 he had saved during college to a hunger relief organization. He discarded every form of identification and embarked on a journey with no destination. The journey made him forget the clamor of the mundane world. He sought to escape the constraints and obligations of the modern world. In June 1990, he headed west, straight toward the spiritual sanctuary of his soul, Alaska. That night, he camped out in the Arizona desert, unaware it was the height of flash flood season. In the middle of the night, a sudden flood struck. With sheer will and resourcefulness, Chris made it through the crisis. To fully sever ties with his past, he removed the license plates from his car and burned all the cash he had. From that moment, he began a new life in the wild. He gave himself a new name, Alexander Supertramp. And so began the true journey of a life he could call his own. Chris lived in a simple tent and hitchhiked his way across the country. Everywhere he went, he took his time to pause and truly take in everything around him. In the deep forest, he paused to listen quietly to the sounds of nature. In August 1990, Chris left Northern California and began hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. Around the same time, his parents realized they had lost all contact with him. Worried sick, they drove to Atlanta in hopes of finding him. But when they arrived, they learned that Chris had vacated his apartment 2 months earlier. With the help of local police, they found his abandoned car. There were no signs of a struggle, which gave his parents some brief relief. But soon, they began to understand. Chris didn't want to be found. His disappearance was likely intentional. Chris's transformation had deep roots in his family history. His mother, Billy, had once been involved in his father's previous marriage. In truth, Chris and his sister, Karine, were born from an earlier relationship. Though their family appeared prosperous and happy on the outside, it was built on a web of lies. Chris and Karine's childhood was marked by domestic violence. Their father's abuse of their mother cast a dark shadow over their early years. Chris could never shake off the label of being born out of wedlock, but he believed that the faraway wilderness of Alaska held the cure for his pain. After leaving the Pacific Crest Trail, Chris met Rainey and Jan, a couple traveling in an RV. They told him about a peaceful place called Slab City, where life was simple and free of worldly troubles. Jan even promised to give him a handmade hat if he agreed to visit. But to a drifter like Chris, every encounter on the road was a fleeting moment of fate. They spent a joyful day together, but the next morning, Chris left quietly without saying goodbye. Because he knew the Alaskan wilderness was still calling out to him, Chris continued to enjoy the joy of traveling alone. A single apple he found became the most delightful treat of the moment.
Hey, Super Apple. I'm not Superman, I'm Super Tramp.
He hitchhiked wherever fate took him, his constant companions being grassy fields and the warmth of the sun. By September, Chris arrived in South Dakota, where vast wheat fields stretched to the horizon. To make a living, he reluctantly bowed to reality and found work on a farm, driving a combine harvester. There, he met the farm owner, Wayne. For the first time, Chris felt the joy of harvest. Wayne, rugged on the outside but warm-hearted within, treated Chris like a brother. Knowing Chris longed for Alaska, he helped him get a rifle and even invited an old hunter to teach him how to hunt and preserve meat. But good times didn't last long. Before the harvest was complete, Wayne was arrested for illegally operating a satellite TV business. Even as he was taken away, he urged Chris to wait until spring before heading north. But to Chris, the farm had lost its life without Wayne. Carrying the memories of that time and the wages he had earned, he set off once again. Chris entered the state of Colorado. That night, a kayak displayed in a store window instantly ignited the fire of adventure in his heart. He hid his belongings beneath a bridge and headed straight to the ranger station the next morning to ask about getting on the river. But the staff told him that acquiring a permit to paddle the river would take a lengthy 12 years. Chris had no intention of waiting that long. Without hesitation, he spent all his savings on that very kayak and fearlessly charged into the roaring Colorado River. Along the way, he encountered a couple of fellow drifters. They admired this lone traveler and invited him to come ashore. The couple shared with Chris a new route. If he followed the river downstream, he could reach the Gulf of California, a journey of more than 300 kilometers. But before they could talk much, the patrol caught up to them, forcing Chris to leave. He continued downriver, drifting past Horseshoe Bend and through the Hoover Dam. In December 1990, he arrived at the Sea of Cortez, sharing the waters with dolphins and whales. Eventually, he entered Mexico through a spillway at the Morelos Dam. He dragged his inflatable kayak through the desert and hitched a ride to the Gulf of Baja. There, he lived in a cave for 36 days, until a storm blew away his kayak. Left with no other choice, Chris had to revise his route and head back north toward the US-Mexico border. But with no documents, he was powerless before the heavily guarded borderline. As night fell, he managed to hop onto a freight train heading back to California. At dawn, before the train reached its destination, Chris tossed down his backpack and slipped into California through an abandoned drainage tunnel. He checked into a shelter in Los Angeles and secured a simple bed. No sooner had he set down his bag than he hurried out to explore. But what he saw on the streets was suffocating, ruined roads filled with lost and desperate souls. Through a restaurant window, he spotted well-dressed men dining inside. That was the very version of himself he had been running from. The men's stiff, hollow smiles filled Chris with deep unease and revulsion. Once again, he boarded a train and fled from this concrete prison. But this time, luck wasn't on his side. A railroad inspector caught him, yanked him off the train, and gave him a harsh beating.
You got any ID?
No, sir.
Of course you don't. Last time, my friend.
Chris returned to the bridge where he had once buried his belongings. He dug them up from the dirt. To continue chasing his dream of reaching Alaska, he had to temporarily make peace with the concrete jungle. But deep down, he remained the untamable wanderer he had always been. During the year Chris vanished, his parents' relationship began to shift in subtle ways. His mother would see disheveled homeless men on the street and always think it might be the son she longed for day and night. By December 1991, Chris finally reached America's last true frontier, Slab City. As if guided by fate, he reunited with Rainey and Jan and, at a party, met a beautiful girl named Tracy. Tracy was gentle and passionate, the embodiment of every boy's dream of a first love. She greeted Chris with a bright smile. They walked together, listening to the tale of the old man building Salvation Mountain. Tracy's eyes never left Chris. Her gaze was filled with bashful sweetness. Together, they pressed their handprints into the base of Salvation Mountain. In the glow of the sunset, they looked like a perfect match. It was the warmest time in Chris's life. That night, Jan opened her heart to Chris and shared a long-buried memory. When she was Tracy's age, she had dreamed of building a happy family of 3 with her husband. But fate had other plans. Her first husband left her and their young son behind, forcing Jan to raise the child alone. Later, she met her current partner, Rainey. Just when life seemed to be improving, her teenage son quietly ran away and never returned. Every time she looked at Chris, she couldn't help but think of her missing child. From that moment on, Jan felt unworthy of love. She hid in emptiness, trying to erase her pain. As the days went by, Chris and Tracy grew closer. However, Chris remained focused on working out and showed little interest in romance. Yet that only made Tracy fall for him even more. Rainey gently remarked that kids can be too cruel to their parents sometimes. His words touched something deep within Chris, who silently stood up and walked away. When he arrived at Tracy's trailer, he found her already waiting for him. She told him her parents had gone into town. But none of it moved Chris. Instead, he chose to join Tracy on stage for a performance, using self-expression to fill the emptiness inside. The warmth of Rainey and Jan's parental affection and Tracy's innocent love were not rare feelings in this desert. This land had witnessed many such stories. People from the noisy cities arriving with heavy hearts in search of inner peace. Here, they could finally lay down their burdens and let their truest feelings and desires run free. But Chris knew, deep in his soul, that this was not the end of his revolution. Alaska still awaited him. He had to leave again. Jan drove her RV and dropped Chris off in Salton City, but at the moment of parting, she couldn't bring herself to give him a warm embrace. Pretending to stay composed, she told Chris to take his bags and go. But just as he was about to leave, she tossed a package to him, then turned around and drove off. Chris opened the package and found the hat Jan had once promised to give him. With Jan's hand-woven hat on his head, Chris set out for the Anza Borrego Desert. In January 1992, at a hot springs campsite in Anza Borrego, Chris met an old man named Ron. Ron wanted to visit Chris's desert camp outside the city. Seeing how young Chris was, Ron urged him to go back to school or get a job, something to give his life more meaning. But Ron didn't understand. Chris was already chasing what he believed to be the most meaningful path. When asked about his family, Chris simply said he was alone. Ron invited him over and opened up about the pain of losing his wife and child. After that dark period, Ron pulled himself together and opened a leather workshop. He had lived there ever since, never stepping out of his comfort zone. During their time together, Chris not only learned the art of leather tooling, but often went out exploring with Ron. He engraved every little memory onto a belt. When Chris revealed he was heading to Alaska, Ron questioned what he was trying to escape. But eventually, Ron was moved by Chris's conviction. With newfound courage, he took a leap of faith and climbed a mountain he had never dared to climb before.
I mean, the core of man's spirit comes from new experiences. And there you are, stubborn old man, sitting on your butt.
Sitting on my butt?
Yeah.
Ha! I'll show you! Sitting on my butt!
At that moment, a wave of sadness surged in Ron's heart. He had a feeling Chris was about to leave. Deep down, Ron knew the real reason Chris chose a life of wandering stemmed from his broken family.
When you forgive, you love. And when you love, God's light shines on you.
On the night of March 22nd, Ron was awakened by a sound outside his bedroom. He had long anticipated that Chris would leave without saying goodbye. Silently, Ron took out a pile of outdoor gear he had prepared just for Chris. As they drove together for the last leg of the journey, neither of them spoke a word. Their unspoken bond would be forever sealed in their hearts. Through Ron's tear-blurred vision, Chris's figure gradually disappeared into the distance. In April 1992, Chris took a train to the Yukon in Canada. 2 days later, he arrived in Fairbanks. After 2 years of traveling, he finally arrived in Alaska. After gathering some essential supplies and a book on local plants and animals, Chris ventured alone into the sacred wilderness of his dreams. He crossed snowy plains, forded rivers, and stepped into the Denali mountain range, the tallest in North America. Chris left Jan's hat on a tree branch as a marker, then continued deeper into the wild. After surviving in the wilderness for a few days, he stumbled upon an abandoned bus, Bus 142. Chris named it the Magic Bus. Inside, there were mattresses, a stove, and even a lighter.
Is there anybody here?
He cleaned the bus, dusted off the mattress, and made it his new home. One day, Chris raised his rifle and took aim at a moose. But just as he was about to pull the trigger, he suddenly realized it wasn't just an animal. It was a mother. He lowered the gun and gave up what could have been months' worth of food. In this wilderness, Chris seemed to discover the purest form of living, free from society, far from the chaos of family. He fully embraced the days spent with nature. Every morning he could feel his truest self, breathing in the fresh air and exploring this land full of surprises. He ran after deer, sprinting wildly through the wild, Tears welled in his eyes, for he could feel his soul, once stained by the world, slowly being cleansed. But he didn't realize that the northern hemisphere was entering summer, and the ice was beginning to melt. Weeks passed. Though his waistline had shrunk considerably, Chris's spirit remained strong. The thrill of wilderness life hadn't faded. It only grew stronger. One day, he spotted a moose. Chris held his breath and slowly raised his rifle. The moose fell. He hurried back to the bus and flipped open a meat preservation guide. Time was tight. He knew that if he didn't process the meat quickly, it would spoil in the warm weather. Chris followed the smoking method taught by the old hunter he'd met on the farm. But he failed. Just a few days later, the meat had rotted and maggots infested it. He had no choice but to return it to the earth. In his journal, he wrote, "I wish I hadn't killed that moose. It's one of the greatest tragedies of my life." Sometime later, his supplies had nearly run out. Then, he came across a passage in a book.
With the possibility of being useful to people to whom it is easy to do good, and who are not accustomed to have it done to them.
Those words deeply shook Chris. In his journal, he wrote, "As dawn brushes the sky, I no longer need to sneak into the unknown. Yet my heart remains entwined with home, natural as breathing, real as sorrow. When I leave, I will understand and remember. My steps grow firmer, driven by a belief eternal as the morning light, guiding me home. I was once bruised and broken, but all wounds shall heal, becoming signposts that clearly point me toward the end." Having conquered the Alaskan wilderness, Chris's soul had undergone a complete revolution. It was time to return to reality. But when he returned to the familiar little river, he was shocked to find the once frozen surface had melted. The calm, gentle stream had turned into a raging torrent. The river, now fierce and unrelenting, severed his only way home. And right there, still hanging from a branch, was the wool hat Jan had given him. He tried to gauge the river's depth, but the branch he leaned on snapped, and Chris was thrown into the surging current. For a moment, the powerful waters nearly swept him away. Luckily, he grabbed a branch just in time and fought with all his strength to crawl back to shore. Drenched in pouring rain, Chris staggered back to the magic bus. He now knew he couldn't leave. Back at the magic bus, Chris was surrounded by loneliness and fear, and to make matters worse, the growing food shortage made him increasingly anxious. Hunger wore him down. His belt gained more and more holes as he grew thinner. His mental state began to deteriorate. Even reading no longer calmed him. Chris began searching for edible plants using a field guide. Starving, he had no choice. He ate a plant described in the book. But the next morning, he found that his body would no longer respond. Frantically, he opened the book again and realized he had mistaken the plant. It closely resembled a toxic one. That plant could cause paralysis, intense hunger, and even death. A wave of despair hit Chris. He carefully compared the plant's markings to those in the guide and confirmed he had eaten the wrong one. The realization threw him into unbearable suffering. Miraculously, Chris survived the poisoning, but he had become far too weak to hunt. Even the grizzly bears showed no interest in his emaciated body. The wilderness had finally trapped him, leaving no path to escape. Chris's life force slowly ebbed away. The soul he had just purified in the wild was now stranded once more within it. He used the last of his strength to write in a book, "Happiness is only real when shared." His eyes were filled with remorse, as if carrying endless unspoken regrets. Chris struggled to bathe himself one final time. Then, with what little strength he had left, he climbed into his sleeping bag and lay on the mattress, quietly awaiting death. His eyes drifted into nothingness, and in that moment, it seemed as if he saw himself traveling through time, wrapped in a warm embrace with his parents. A tear slid from the corner of his eye. And just like that, Chris's life came to an end. This is a true story. Chris was an idealist to the extreme, a traveler in pursuit of freedom. He refused to be bound by civilized society. He chose isolation and ultimately disappeared into the wilderness. Some criticized him as selfish, saying he abandoned his loved ones and ignored the laws of nature. But others loved him deeply, unconditionally, for his courage to break free and the way his spirit of freedom inspired a generation. I too have, in fleeting moments, spread out a map, ready to throw everything away and leave. But at each dawn, I tuck the thought back into a drawer and return to the rhythm of a 9-to-5 life. Those sudden escape plans eventually became nothing more than an ideal, buried deep within my heart. So maybe the kind of life we love doesn't really matter. What matters is whether we have the ability to love it, whether we've tried to reach for it, whether we have the discipline to hold on, the courage to let go, and the right to choose.